This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the course of the hour, we'll go through all the business news stories you need to know about from right across the continent. But first, a quick run through the markets here for you. So South African markets essentially got back to trading today after yesterday's break, but the JSE essentially ended up closing a lot lower on most of the indices. Naspers dragging the indices down with a 4% decline. Tencent also declined in trading today in Hong Kong. Bank stocks also were in decline. The bank index there closed 0.8% lower. We'll be talking about the NSE in Kenya in a bit more detail. Major political risks on the horizon. How should you trade around that? That conversation is coming up shortly, including this. Egypt's central bank cuts interest rates in order to spur economic growth. Sudan's quest for debt relief suffers yet another political setback. And the IMF expresses cautious optimism about the global economic outlook despite the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's start the hour in North Africa, where Egypt's central bank has cut the overnight deposit rate, the overnight lending rate, and the rate of the main operation by 50 basis points to 8.75%, 9.75%, and 9.25%. respectively. Now, the discount rate was also cut at its latest Monetary Policy Committee meeting by 50 basis points to 9.25%. The new cuts are the first since the central bank slashed rates by over 300 basis points in March amid the COVID-19 crisis. Here's CGTN's Yasser Hakim starting us off tonight.
The decision by the Central Bank of Egypt to trim the key interest rates took most experts by surprise. Most pundits had predicted interest rates will remain unchanged for a fifth session. Even the International Monetary Fund, in its latest report on Egypt, has warned against cutting rates at this point.
Reducing interest rates could have a negative effect on Egypt's bond issuance. Egypt bonds are the most attractive in the region and are always oversubscribed. But when you reduce rates, investors can offload and invest in your competitors. The recession caused by the coronavirus led many emerging markets, such as Turkey and Argentina, to raise their interest rates and lure bond investors.
Officials at the Cairo-based Apex Bank, however, defied these warnings and went ahead with 0.5% cut.
The government is looking at the overall economy with a different perspective. Priority now is for investments and production to stimulate the economy, create jobs and revenue. Next year's state budget shows huge funds have been allocated for investments and mega projects, so it's time to encourage businessmen to re-enter the market and push the economy forward.
The central bank also cancelled the high 15% interest rate certificates issued last March. These certificates were aimed at providing an extra source of revenue for citizens during the recession caused by the COVID pandemic.
Banks collected 4 trillion Egyptian pounds from Egyptians who bought the certificates to benefit from its high returns. However, consumption in the market dropped considerably in the last couple of months because consumers' money was still in the banks. This trend usually slows down the economy and harms businesses. CBE decided it's time to cancel the certificates.
To contain the effects of COVID-19 pandemic, the CBE took some procedures in March, including slashing interest rates by 3%, the biggest cut since 2016. Rates had remained fixed for 4 sessions. While some experts fear that lowering rates this week will weaken the Egyptian pound and push inflation up, others are confident Cairo will sustain this transition.
Inflation is at around 3%, the lowest in a decade, so I don't expect prices to go up. That's why the CBE reduced rates by only 0.5%. First, to not push away investors in treasury bills and bonds, and also to avoid adverse effects on the value of the Egyptian pound. But if rates drop further in the near future, the government should support other sources of revenue like increasing exports, foreign direct investments, remittances, and so forth.
Now that the government's economic strategy is leaning towards attracting investments and projects back to the country, most analysts are predicting additional interest rate cuts of at least 2% or more by the end of the year. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
Let's make a brief detour to Kenya's capital markets. Investors here have filed complaints with the country's capital market regulator against the investment firm Cited. They say it failed to repay a total of $1.12 million invested with it upon maturity in one of its funds. Now, the funds in question have been the target of a long-running legal battle. The spat began when the Capital Markets Authority told Citon's high-yield funds to reduce its investments in Citon-managed real estate projects to no more than 10% of the fund's total assets under management. Citon responded by challenging that directive in court. The High Court has since issued stay orders against the CMA, pending a full hearing. Now, earlier this week on Monday, Kenya's Chief Justice recommended that Parliament be dissolved for failing to pass legislation required to enact gender equity rules baked into the Constitution. The following day, trading volumes at the Nairobi Securities Exchange nearly tripled. Now, the benchmark NSE 20, to be clear, has risen by at least 2.4% so far in September, and Thursday saw the second highest trading volumes in the month, with over 43 million shares changing hands. But on a year-to-date basis, the NSE 20 has fallen by over 30%, falling well past the last multi-year low that was hit in March 2009. Back then, the index was at 2,363 points. The recommendation to dissolve the 12th Parliament is facing a legal challenge, and the High Court has put a stay on its execution pending a full hearing. Earlier on, I spoke to Mwathi Kilonzo of EFG Hermes. I started by asking him how portfolio managers are assessing this latest layer of political and policy uncertainty.
When you bring in a very particular type of political risk, which is also difficult to understand, because if you look through the document, you'd have to be a lawyer to really understand what the implications are. And I still don't think that the market has fully digested this information. But nevertheless, what it does introduce is the risk of a period of politicking, a period in which companies have to start adjusting their own business models, irrespective of what's going on with COVID, for a time when people have to vote, etc. And also it means that some key legislation, for example, things like controlling the interest rate on microfinance, mobile money loans, things like that actually will be kicked to the curb and slow down.
The flip side of it is, I guess, as you said, some of those policy agenda items are going to be kicked off to the curb. The good thing, at least in this fiscal year, is that we already have a Finance Act in place. So the horizon as far as taxes are concerned is clear all the way to June next year. But are there any big fiscal risks or policy risks that we should be worried about, other than the fact that, yes, we're heading into an election?
I think we should be worried about quite a few things. You know, there is a very fine balancing act that's currently in progress. One is the dollar inflows. You know, tourism is essentially dead, and it's very hard to forecast when tourism will recover internationally. So that takes away a key source of dollar inflows. You also have remittances, which have, you know, despite what everyone was expecting, have remained extremely resilient. However, what isn't clear is how long that resiliency will continue. And that's very much dependent on the labor markets in the key markets for us, which are Europe and the US. So if you continue to see a second wave of coronavirus as you have in parts of Europe, and potentially another issue in the US as well, then remittances become a big question. So ultimately, policymakers have to sit there and think about, what do they do about the shilling? Where does the shilling react? How do they also protect exporters who are very vulnerable, and also importers who will increasingly require sources of FX, which may not be there. So I think there are quite a few near-term risks, which are very hard to forecast, that the market really has to think about and worry.
I know a little earlier you said that the implications of what this recommendation from the Chief Justice, a legally binding one at that, are still being digested. But one of the things that we did see on, at least so far this week, trading volumes have been well above the 15-day moving average for most of this week. That 15-day moving average is about 23 or so million shares changing hands in every single session. Can we infer, though, from that there's any kind of connection, perhaps, between that rise that we're seeing in trading volumes and that decision that came out on Monday?
Well, I think it's not an unreasonable assumption, but from what we have seen from coming through our trading desks, there isn't a correlation. I think the volumes that you are seeing in the market are certain investors who are taking advantage of names where they either think that the stocks have been beaten up too much, so there is an opportunity, or rotating into what they think are quality names.
Indeed. One of the other interesting trends here, the price earnings ratio, for example, across the NSE 20 has been falling pretty consistently since 2016. 10.36 was the average back then. Now we're essentially at around 7 on a trailing basis. Price to book values ratios, those have essentially been chopped in half as well. Let's assume, for argument's sake, that this uncertainty continues through to the end of the year. How then would you reposition your portfolio?
I think you basically have to look at companies where you think the management teams are smart and nimble, and also facilitated by a strong balance sheet, and also have the right sort of conservatism in their businesses. So ultimately, you want a business that's well run. You want a business where management is making the right decisions at the right time, because there's a lot of uncertainty and there's a lot of external factors that are out of the control of any person. So in this environment, you would sort of pivot yourself towards the larger cap names. You know, names like Safaricom come to mind. You look at EABL, you look at the larger banks, KCB, Equity Bank, and you know, really that is how you would position your portfolio, because the worst place to be in is where you're involved in a stock which doesn't have a good balance sheet, and this uncertainty continues into next year, and suddenly the company doesn't have enough money to continue as a going concern.
Indeed, so it's arguably more of the same, because really that's a big chunk of the sort of trading activity that we've been seeing all year, with this flight to quality, for lack of a better word, jumping into Safaricom, the tier 1 banks, the East African Buries and the BATs of this world.
Yes, I mean, that is true. And that is also a function of, you know, if you go back to pre-COVID, so pre-March, you also had seen investors that started to gravitate towards companies where there was liquidity in the stock. So there has, you know, so whether it's the current uncertainty, that is also added to a natural progression towards names where you could get in and out easily. And those are the names that you've just read out.
On to South Africa now. The country will adopt a risk-based system in deciding which countries will be allowed to resume flights to its territory. Africa's most industrialized economy will reopen her international borders on the 1st of October. Travel, however, will be limited to countries that do not have high COVID-19 caseloads. Anyone traveling to South Africa must have a negative COVID-19 test result not older than 72 hours. Failure to provide this could result in mandatory quarantine at the traveller's cost. All travellers will also be required to download the COVID-19 Alert app, which will facilitate contact tracing by authorities in South Africa.
If people come to our country applying for visa, part of the things we're looking at, you must have, you know, a certification that about 72 hours you tested and you were COVID negative.
We can't be quibbling about loss of revenue over a few months, because the process is going to be long and hard to get passenger confidence back, to get airlines. You have seen newspaper coverage indicating airlines that have been shut down, that have been liquidated.
Ghana, in the meantime, has announced plans to raise the price that farmers get paid for the cocoa bean deliveries by nearly 30%. Growers of the bean, in the world's second largest producer of the crop, will now be paid $1,837 a tonne for the harvest season that starts on the 1st of October and runs until next September in 2021. These changes come after the living income differential was charged on the beans. For the current season, which ends next week Wednesday, farmers are being paid $1,400 a tonne. Now, the price increase is pretty much in line with an expected rise in Cote d'Ivoire, right next door. It's the world's top cocoa producer. The two countries account for roughly 60% of global production of cocoa. A quick run through some company headlines now. Let's start with the food sector. Famous brand. It's the owners of the Steers, Wimpy and Debonair's pizza franchises in South Africa. It's warned of a hefty full-year loss. That's amid trade disruptions from the COVID-19 pandemic and another write-down of gourmet outlet Burger Kitchen. Now, the group expects a headline loss per share of anywhere between 216 to 264 cents a share in the 6 months ending in August. That's from headline earnings of 159 cents a share in 2019. Also, the Chinese smartphone manufacturer Oppo has opened an office in South Africa. It plans to bring the range of the company's devices to that market. Now, Oppo says it has partnered with a number of major retailers to offer its mid-range A-series smartphones in the country. These will be available from the 7th of October. Recommended retail prices start from around $400 US. General Electric says it will walk away from an agreement to build a 1,050 megawatt coal-fired power plant near the coastal town of Lamu in Kenya. The company was to design, construct and maintain the power plant, whose cost was estimated at $2 billion. GE is among the companies which are divesting from coal and other non-renewable sources of energy, partly due to pressure from investors and environmental activists who are seeking to tackle the increasingly pressing problem of climate change. And Boeing's grounded 737 MAX may get regulatory approval to resume flying in November and enter service by the end of the year. That at least is according to Europe's chief aviation safety regulator. Boeing has been working with regulators around the world, particularly in the US and in the EU, in order to get the 737 MAX back in the skies following two fatal crashes that killed 346 people, including some in Ethiopia. That led to a worldwide grounding of the jet in March 2019. That's a run through your company headlines. You're watching Global Business Africa. Plenty more content coming up, including this. Sudan's quest for debt relief suffers yet another new political setback. And Tunisia's State Petroleum Corporation is looking for taxpayer bailout in order to stay afloat. The details coming up next.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay, we'll head out now.
Beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra Naidu. Hello, Nairobi.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
Welcome back to the program. Now, despite over a year of negotiations, Sudan is facing yet another fresh obstacle to getting off the US terrorism list, which has severely hurt its economy. The latest one is a demand that it normalizes relations with Israel. However, 3 Sudanese government officials say the country is resisting linking these two issues. Sudan's designation as a state sponsor of terror dates back to its toppled ruler, Omar Hassan al-Bashir, and it makes it very difficult for the new transitional government to get access to desperately needed debt relief and foreign financing because the country is basically locked out of international capital markets. Sudan's skyrocketing inflation and its plummeting currency have been the biggest challenge to the nation's stability. Elsewhere, Tunisia's state-owned petroleum corporation is appealing for the government to inject capital into it and rescue it from a rising tide of debts that have now risen to over $614 million. That debt load is significantly impacting its operations, it says. A string of challenges, including, of course, the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic and the post-revolution political instability, have all compounded Tunisia's economic recovery, leaving several of its public enterprises deep in financial crisis. Here's CGTN's Adin Chouachi with the details.
The Tunisian Company of Petroleum Activities was created in 1972 in order to increase control and actively and directly participate in all hydrocarbons-related operations. But the state-owned enterprise is now facing unprecedented financial challenges, which threatens to shut down the state corporation.
Now, thousands of jobs are threatened because the Tunisian Company of Petroleum Activities does not have the necessary resources to honor its financial commitments. It's unacceptable that this public enterprise becomes a burden while it has been used to provide billions to the state fund.
Energy experts have urged the government to intervene and find urgent solutions to help the ailing company that is saddled with debt. ETAP achieved a net profit of around $170 million in 2018, but is facing a liquidity crunch.
Ejecting funds into the indebted public enterprises to help them out of their financial crisis is the state's responsibility. The government cannot remain neutral while one of the pillars of the national economy is sinking.
The Industry and Energy Commission at the Tunisian Parliament shed light on the difficulties facing the Tunisian Company of Petroleum Activities. Legislators explained that ETAP's indebtedness is due to outstanding debts of public enterprises.
If public enterprises paid ETAP, then it would have enough funds to pay foreign companies which provide logistical and technical assistance as well as the Tunisian state. It's a vicious cycle.
According to Tunisia's Ministry of Energy and Mines, domestic crude oil production was 856 kilotons at the end of June 2020, recording a slight decrease of 0.7% compared to the end of June 2019. Natural gas resources recorded a decline of 8% at the end of June 2020 compared to the same period of the previous year. Energy experts say that the Tunisian Company of Petroleum Activities, ETAP, is promoting the hydrocarbon sector by conducting studies of developing discoveries as well as developing the oil and gas productions. Despite the recent difficulties, the company remains one of the flagships of the Tunisian economy. Adnan Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
On to South Africa now, where the conferencing industry is preparing to reopen for business after new lockdown regulations eased restrictions on gatherings and travel. Now, the sector has been through a brutal 6 months, with many stakeholders within the conferencing value chain forced to close due to the pandemic restrictions. But now there's new hope on the horizon that the events industry may stage a much-needed recovery. Here's CGTN's Travis Andrews with this report.
The Cape Town International Convention Centre may have been turned into a temporary COVID-19 hospital during the city's infection surge, but now it's back to business and open to events. Before the pandemic hit, the city managed to establish itself as one of the leading events and conferencing destinations, with world-class facilities that could host the likes of the World Economic Forum on Africa, the Mining Indaba, and the Africa Oil Week. But 6 months into the COVID-19 lockdown, and the conferencing industry is slowly attempting to rebuild its calendar of events.
We are speaking to especially the international planners to try and assist them with questions and queries and concerns they might have to still host the event. Those events are very important to kickstart our economy specifically in the first quarter of 2021. So we're having a very close contact with especially the big ones like Mining Indaba and the others.
New lockdown alert level 1 regulations now means that international travel to South Africa is allowed, albeit with a prohibition on business travelers coming from countries with high COVID-19 infection numbers. No more than 250 people can also be gathered at any one particular event, which rules out big gatherings at the Cape Town International Convention Centre, which regularly hosts over 15,000 delegates at a time. It's those conferences that have the greatest impact on the local economy, and that's why all stakeholders are now banding together to thrash out a plan to boost the industry's fortunes.
The conference sector in South Africa has come together very nicely. They formed a new council and a new body and understand the value of their own sector and collecting big data about the sector and why events are important, not only just a jazz or a sport event, but the value add and the value chain is so large for the sector. So the industry is pushing really hard to make sure that these things can still take place.
South Africa's conferencing sector may look to the local market for some much needed growth, but it is the big international events that really drive this industry. And with countries from key source markets likely to be barred from entering the country, at least in the medium term, it seems it will be a slow recovery for the industry for the next 12 to 18 months. Travis Andrews, CGTN, Cape Town.
We're still in South Africa. The country's creative arts industry is facing a crisis after the government imposed restrictions over there designed, of course, to stop the spread of COVID-19. Performing artists have been surviving with little or virtually no income until audiences do return, and when that happens is still unclear. The theatre industry has been shedding jobs at an accelerated pace since a lockdown was put in place by the government in late March. Here's CGTN's Yolisa Njamela taking up the story.
The creative arts industry depends on gatherings to a large degree. Gatherings mean ticket sales, art sales, book sales, among others. Festivals, fairs, galleries, museums, and theatre productions need people in order to survive or thrive. The 6-month-long lockdown period has meant no revenue generation for the industry. The lockdown was effected by the government to fight the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Well, there's a number of challenges in the creative industry. Firstly, the industry by its own nature, it's around entertainment, interaction, and mainly social gatherings. So in the creative industry, the first thing that has to happen when you talk about the actors, they have to go with a crew where they will be shooting their pictures.
Well, the Soweto Theatre is quite a busy theatre. Throughout the year we have rental clients, we've got productions, we sell tickets, and a lot of the work that we do employs artists, performers, lighting technicians, sound guys, rigging people. So, the COVID pandemic resulted in the Soweto Theatre not having any shows.
In order to survive this period, some in the industry found other ways to sustain their business.
So we were streaming, and we did see some people coming in to watch the streamed shows, but what we did pick up was it's very difficult to actually ticket streaming in South Africa. People don't really believe in paying for a ticket and then paying for data as well. So it was very difficult to kind of get people to tune in to watch a 2-hour-long theatre production online. That's already quite a big demand on their data, and then also ask them to pay for a ticket. So we didn't actually sell any tickets for the shows.
South Africa's Department of Arts and Culture released a 150 million rand relief fund to assist artists during this time of a pandemic. Relief was only offered to those whose events or projects were cancelled as a result of the lockdown. But the funds didn't reach everyone. As a result, the South African cultural and creative industry organizations marched to Parliament last week over non-payment of the relief fund. They were also demanding the reopening of the entertainment industry. Now that the country has moved to level down lockdown, things have eased up a bit, but the creative industry remains unhappy. The unions and artists say it's still simply not enough.
No, it's not enough. We are on level 1. The president spoke about 200 people indoors and so forth. That's not enough. If you are a person that relies largely on gigs, you want a massive crowd. And remember, you also have to pay for the venue, you also have to pay for all the logistical part of things, the advertisers and so forth.
According to the Arts and Culture Ministry, the creative industries sector contributes some 2.9% to the country's GDP. Yolisa Njamela for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
On to the Horn of Africa now. In early 2012, heavy fighting broke out in the historic coastal city of Marka in Somalia's Lower Shabelle region. Now, the violence over there raged for years, uprooting thousands of people from their homes and their farms. But through a combination of intervention from clan elders and backing from the federal government, the community in surrounding areas are now enjoying the fruits of peace. This comes in the wake of a 2018 peace agreement signed by representatives from the sub-clans that were essentially at war.
The Haba Gidir and Biomal subclans are the two main communities living in Marka. Marka is about 90 kilometers south of the Somali capital, Mogadishu. Conflict between the two clans began over control of the rich agricultural land in the region.
The Biomal believed that they were the owners of this land and that the Haba Gidir had no right to live here.
Dozens were believed to have been killed during the fighting that went on for 6 years. Many, including women and children, were forced to flee the area, fearing for their lives and property.
Schools were closed as parents feared sending their children out. Homes were deserted, and there were no medical facilities.
As women of the Lower Shabelle region, we have gone through really tough times. We have lost our sons and husbands in these conflicts and wars. There was an incident where a pregnant woman gave birth under a tree and bled to death due to lack of medical services.
After a few years of fighting, views over the conflict gradually began to soften.
We realized we were fighting over nothing. We agreed as elders to first reconcile amongst ourselves before trying to end the conflict.
We agreed on 3 resolutions: a cessation of hostilities, the holding of a more inclusive peace conference in Marka with the support of the federal government and international partners, and integrating the sub-clan militias into the government forces.
In early 2017, Somalia's federal government supported a more formal reconciliation initiative. Elders from both sides, commanders and peace activists came together to discuss ways of ending the hostilities.
We reached a sweet peace deal in the Lower Shabelle region. Today, you will not hear the sound of a bullet being fired or see sub-clans fighting.
After a months-long negotiation process, the two sub-clans buried the hatchet. The residents of Marka are now enjoying the outcomes of these efforts. Daniela Pearson, CGTN.
We're essentially halfway into the hour. You're watching Global Business Africa. Here's what's coming up next. We'll explore why the IMF is cautiously optimistic about the global economic outlook despite the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the UK government has unveiled an emergency jobs preservation scheme. The details next.
Business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant.
Only on CGTN.
I try to not let it affect me, but there are days when it does. I'm a human being, and to see patients in a hospital bed and their family members are not there, there's no one there to hold their hand, that human touch, you know?
I just hope everyone can remember that the situation is not permanent and that everything will get better eventually.
Welcome back to the program. These are some of the stories making your headlines at this hour. Starting in Mali, a former defense minister, Ba Ndao, has been sworn in as interim president at a ceremony in Bamako. The 70-year-old will serve for 18 months before a transition into civilian rule. In his inaugural speech, he promised a stable, calm and successful transition in the agreed conditions and timeframe. The inauguration marks the start of Mali's return to civilian rule following a military coup in August. The junta leader, Colonel Assimi Goïta, will serve as vice president. Elsewhere, the death toll from an attack by suspected rebels in the eastern end of the Democratic Republic of Congo has gone up to 11. This comes after 5 more people were killed on Thursday. Authorities say that overnight attack was carried out in the territory of Beni. Around the world, the youth climate movement returned to the streets for a national day of action. South Africans were not left behind. There were protests in Cape Town and a picket at the Medupi coal-fired power station. According to the organisers, the protest took place in Durban, Port Elizabeth, Klerksdorp and Welkom. And finally, a senior official from China's Drug Registration Bureau says 4 Chinese vaccine candidates are undergoing final stage tests in other countries. The official said China has been working on 5 kinds of vaccines and 11 candidates are at different stages of testing and development. He gave no specific time, however, when a vaccine would be available on the market. That's a run through your headlines. The International Monetary Fund says the global economic outlook is less bleak than projected back in June. The Washington-based lender didn't make a new projection, but it says that parts of the global economy have started to turn around, even though challenges still remain ahead. The IMF is set to next update its global outlook in the middle of October. In its June forecast, it forecasts that economic output around the world would drop by nearly 5%. And that COVID-19 would wipe out $12 trillion worth of output over 2 years. Economists also feared that a second wave of infections could severely damage growth. Governments, including those in the UK and France, have reinstituted some restrictions in recent days, although on a much more limited scale compared to earlier on in 2020. In the meantime, farmers in India have taken to the streets to protest reforms that they say are not in their interest. Several farming and trade unions and opposition parties have blocked motorways and railway tracks in different states, but much of the protest, at least so far, has been concentrated in the states of Punjab and Haryana, where farm yields are relatively high. Now, the government has defended the bills in question, recently approved by Parliament, as reform measures that will help rid India's vast agricultural sector of old laws. The government also insists that the new rules will give farmers the option to sell their produce to private buyers, but it will still buy staples like rice and wheat at guaranteed prices.
The 2 bills will bring revolutionary change to the lives of the farmers, improve the economic conditions of the farmers, boost agriculture, stop the farmers' exploitation, and double the farmers' income. The farmers will be attracted to expensive crops and investment will reach the villages. The farmers will be connected with modern technologies and produce yields of international standards. And they will be exempted from all the taxes and their financial condition will be improved.
On to Malaysia now. Its multi-billion-dollar palm oil industry has long relied on low-paid foreign labour. And now it's suffering from an acute labour shortage after many of those workers left during the coronavirus pandemic. And the government imposed a freeze on migrant workers coming into the country. Businesses are now looking to local labour pools, including prison parolees, in order to try and fill some of that shortfall. Here's CGTN's Ryan Meltzer with this report.
Around 8 out of 10 workers in Malaysia's palm oil estates are foreign, mostly from Indonesia. Even pre-pandemic, the industry was short some 36,000 workers, costing it billions of dollars in lost production. Thousands more migrants have since gone home. Malaysians have long shunned plantation work, viewing it as too physically demanding and, as many see it, demeaning. The industry has been working hard to change that perception and recruit more locals.
Sebabkan pandemik COVID-19, saya kehilangan pekerjaan.
When the pandemic hit, I lost my job in the airline industry. My suggestion is that Malaysians keep an open mind. They cannot be so choosy about what work they do, especially now. Plantation work is good work.
Palm oil giant Sime Darby has also been working with the prisons department to recruit parolees.
They are paid as per any of our other workers. They will be able to learn new skills employable skills, and at the end of their sentence, they can then join a productive workforce. To date, we only see about 60 that voluntarily coming into the placement program. And coupled with the locals that we hired, which was only about 300, this is not going to close at all the labour shortage.
The industry is striving to make the work less arduous for locals.
We are looking how to simplify the job. Now very seriously looking at mechanization, automation. Actually, we have gone a long way in terms of mechanization, in terms of crop evacuation, herbicide spraying, fertilizer application. But the core, most critical operation, which is bringing down the fruit from the tree, that is still manually reliant.
And still almost entirely done by foreigners. Hence the industry's urgent plea for the government to relax its freeze on bringing in new migrant workers. Ryan Meltzer, CGTN, Kerry Island, Malaysia.
The UK's Finance Minister has unveiled an emergency job support plan that will take effect in October. Now, this comes amid fears that hundreds of thousands of people could lose their jobs without government assistance of some kind. Our correspondent Andrew Wilson has the details.
Flanked by a top industrialist and a trades union leader, the Chancellor posed for the cameras. The usual autumn budget has been cancelled, but this emergency statement is every bit as serious.
Mr. Speaker, I know people are anxious and afraid and exhausted at the prospect of further restrictions on our economic and social freedoms.
And in Parliament, his words were carefully chosen.
The job support scheme is built on 3 principles. First, it will support viable jobs. To make sure of that, employees must work at least a third of their normal hours and be paid for that work as normal by their employer. The government, together with employers, will then increase those people's wages, covering 2/3 of the pay they have lost by reducing their working hours. And the employee will keep their job.
To small and medium-sized businesses, work just a third of your usual hours and the government will support you. It's a direct move to prevent jobs being shed when the furlough scheme times out next month. Mr. Sunak singled out the hospitality and tourism industries, postponing a planned rise in their VAT until the end of March 2020. And 4 existing government-backed loan schemes have also been extended. This is not the juggernaut of the hugely expensive furlough scheme, blanket support for jobs across the board. This is a direct attempt to allow those jobs that have a future to survive, and at the same time let those that have been permanently destroyed by the pandemic become exposed and fall away. Far from London on a police visit, the Prime Minister added his support with his own reminder on public behaviour.
Today we're continuing to do everything we can to support the workforce, support jobs, livelihoods throughout the crisis, and again some very creative and imaginative proposals from the Chancellor. But here the really important thing is that everybody follows the guidance that we've set out.
The government is trying to push the country in a direction. Keep working, be careful, hope for the best. It's racking up quite a bill, but nothing like the one it would face had it responded to pressure to extend the furlough scheme. Andrew Wilson, CGTN, London.
Winemakers in Germany are raising their glasses after China and the EU signed an agreement that recognises their distinctive status in the Chinese market. Rheinhessen wine was one of 100 regional products to be given that kind of protection. 100 Chinese products will get essentially the same recognition in the EU. CGTN's Mark Webster has this report.
Wine from grapes grown here in the rolling vineyards of Rheinhessen will one day grace dining tables around the world, but increasingly those in China. This patchwork of vines hasn't always had a great reputation, and until the 90s turned out millions of bottles of semi-sweet wine like Blue Nun and Liebfraumilch. Now Christopher Turler, along with his brother Johannes and a local group of largely younger winemakers, are rebranding their wines for the international market with higher quality and a matching price. Turler Winery has been in the family for nearly 500 years. Over time, some aspects have changed far less than others. Hand-picking these Sauvignon Blanc grapes is just one of many techniques they employ to ensure everything is premium quality, essential, they say, in the highly competitive Chinese market.
We are aiming for the highest quality of the grapes, so a lot of work in the vineyards is obviously needed over the year to produce perfect grapes, because only out of perfect grapes you can make a great wine.
Their winemaking process is kept simple to protect their status as an organic producer and to ensure each of the 120 small vineyards they have maintains its distinctive characteristics. Once the grapes are squeezed, they are left for up to 8 hours to soak up the flavours from the skins and, after pressing, transferred to oak barrels, where the juice, with little added, is left to ferment. What the winemakers here say is that there is no blueprint for making a great wine. Each of the wines in each of these German oak barrels has completely its own character, perhaps drier, perhaps sweeter, perhaps more acidic. And they say it's that increasing sophistication of their wines which is appealing to the Chinese market. China is now Turler's biggest overseas market, and Christoph has been making 3 or 4 trips there every year. Thanks to the recent agreement between China and the EU to protect the Rheinhessen brand, he's confident exports will grow further. Here at the German Wine Institute, they believe it will prove to Chinese consumers that the brand can be trusted.
For our producers, it's also very important because often those wines which were imitations were of very low quality, obviously a lot cheaper, and they actually destroyed or did harm to the image of our wines.
Germany currently produces more than 1 billion bottles of wine a year, though the vast majority is consumed at home. Winemakers say they will have to continue to improve the quality of their wines if they're to increase the value of their overseas sales. Mark Webster, CGTN, Rheinhessen.
A 3-day conference on financial technology titled Inclusion is underway in Shanghai. It's been organized by the Ant Group. It's a fintech firm backed by the Chinese e-commerce giant Alibaba. CGTN's Yang Qingxi is on the ground.
Inclusion. The name of the conference refers to the potential of financial technologies to empower more industries and ensure more consumers enjoy the benefits of digital innovation.
One of the earliest experiences for many Chinese people in how fintech transforms their financial lives occurred in 2013.
That's when Alipay rolled out a money market fund called Yuebao. There were already over 200 of them on the market at the time, but mobile payments have made it so accessible that it's now the world's largest money market fund with about 600 million users. Competitors are now setting their sights on the same success, and that includes Vanguard, one of the world's largest mutual funds. Its joint venture in China with Ant Group has rolled out an investment advisory service this year on Alipay called Bangnitou, or Help You Invest.
It can invest across 7,000 funds and establish tailor-made portfolios for each customer. It can also flexibly adjust the portfolios during investing.
Its ambition to democratize investing is seen in its low requirements of about $113. 100 days after its establishment, it's acquired some 200,000 clients.
Many mature and experienced investors have joined. A lot of them are young people.
Experts explain the thinking behind the strategy.
The biggest hurdle is a trust factor, where people have to get used to actually buying and investing using their mobile or doing it online, and that's something that is learned. But in China, we are already there. We've got we've been buying investment products through the likes of Alipay's Yuebao for years now. It's second nature to us.
As China further opens up the sector to international firms, more and more foreign companies are entering the Chinese market, increasing competition and giving investors even more options to choose from. Yang Qingxi, CGTN, Shanghai.
Right, then a quick run through commodities before we get into the last part of the bulletin. Oil prices, let's start there. Brent is down by nearly 0.1%, $41.91 a barrel. On fears essentially on demand still eviscerating, COVID-19 eviscerating demand for oil in the future. That said, on the other side of the Atlantic, the Baker Hughes rig count is actually moving in a positive direction. We have 6 rigs added to the count so far this week, 261 active oil rigs in the United States, but still remember, 72% decline in the Baker Hughes rig count so far this year. And there's really no sign of recovery, at least a strong and sustained one on that front. Here's what's coming up next. We'll take a look at a startup that's developing life-saving battery-powered prosthetics in Tunisia when we come back. Welcome back to the program. A startup in Tunisia is getting a fair bit of praise for its role in developing affordable artificial limbs by using whatever tech is available. Since its set up shop back in 2018, Cure Bionics has been working on a product that has continuously evolved from a very simple mechanical prosthetic limb into a battery-powered solution with multiple sensors. Some of the latest versions, in fact, can be 3D printed. CGTN's Adnan Chouachi taking a closer look at a startup that's creating prosthetics for those in need.
27 years old, Mohammed Dawafi is the founder and CEO of Cure Bionics, a startup that develops and manufactures bionic hands and arms for people with disabilities. The electronics and embedded systems engineer from the prestigious École Nationale d'Ingénieurs de Sousse and his team are trying to change the lives of thousands of disabled and handicapped people in the North African country.
My startup Cure Bionics is empowering people with disabilities, focusing currently on people with limb differences, people who were born with no hands or got amputations. So we are empowering them with 3D printed bionic arms, also with physical rehabilitation solutions using virtual reality, gamification.
Cure Bionics offers many products and services at an affordable price to help thousands who are in need of the artificial limbs. The startup targets to win over the prosthetics market by offering competitive prices in both the domestic and international markets, where millions of people are in need of the life-changing products.
Starting from the price, it will be very competitive. We are talking about 1/3 or 1/4 of the cheapest one in the market. We are also talking about features that are empowering, like the customization of the prosthetic. Actually, the users will have the ability to customize their prosthetics using external covers that can be continuously changeable.
Many talented interns and engineers have joined the adventure, despite its limited financial resources and the daily technical challenges. This vibrant group is focused on innovation and scientific research.
The idea behind being a young engineer working for a cause, it all starts from a challenging ourselves at the first place, like believing in ourselves to do everything, and challenging the difficulties that everyone, and as youngs or people did not find jobs or whatever, make the challenge to make your own job, your own comfort zone, your own everything. Like challenge the existence, the problems, and make it to yourself.
According to the startup founder, who has also been recently featured in the Forbes Middle East 30 and the 30 2020 edition, the idea behind the launch of Cure Bionics is closely linked to the noble cause of serving people with disabilities and facilitating their lives. The initiative shows the importance of technology in achieving life goals for disabled people. Mohammed and his team plan to conquer the North African market and to internationalize by selling their made-in-Tunisia products globally. The Tunisian startup, which was founded at the National School of Engineers of Sousse, will soon open a new research center at the Technopole of Sousse. Adnan Chouachi, CGTN, Tunis.
Well, our story for you, this one's from the content creation side of things. The Tanzanian platform Milad Ayo has become the first African media outlet to hit 1 billion views on its YouTube channel. That milestone comes hot on the heels of the Tanzanian musician Diamond Platnumz becoming the first African musician to hit 1 billion views back in June. Tanzania has one of the highest numbers of YouTube users and some pretty prolific content creators over there on the continent. CGTN's Daniel Kijo explores that area.
Be it in Tanzania's urban cities or rough rural areas, journalist Millard Ayo finds stories to share with the world. Millard Ayo's recipe for success is simple: get the news out to the people without fail. His online news empire has been growing steadily since 2012 when he started. He covers a wide variety of news from sports, breaking news, politics, entertainment, and more. And now 8 years later, he has grown a substantial audience.
YouTube called and congratulated me for reaching 1 billion views. They also said congrats because you stand alone, as no other media entity has hit 1 billion views.
34-year-old Millard Ayo now stands at 3 million subscribers on his YouTube channel. Coming from humble beginnings, he reinvested every cent he made into his dream. Now, his social media platforms have viewers in Tanzania, Kenya, India, the US, Nigeria, and more. Digital marketing expert Ramah Nyang says Millard's consistency has been key to his success.
He has been consistent with producing good content, but also easy to consume content. You would find clear messages, and he really knows how to tap into the consumer behavior or the people who are actually consuming the content online.
According to a report released by technology think tank Research ICT Africa, internet data charges in Tanzania are the cheapest in East Africa, averaging at $1 for a gigabyte. This has allowed consumers to access online platforms like millardayo.com at a cheaper rate.
I think Tanzania was mentioned mid last year, that it's one of the cheapest, it has the cheapest internet services compared to other countries. So you would see that first of all you have internet access, but also it's cheap so that it can be accessed by a lot of people.
YouTube content gives generators like Millard Ayo a chance to earn money if their work is able to pull many viewers. But getting to numbers that generate income is no easy task. With about 43% internet penetration, Tanzania is well above the estimated African average. The success of Millard Ayo shows that even more Tanzanians are moving online. He's now become a role model for people who want to build business and audiences online. Ayo has grown to become a prominent radio and TV personality without using scandals that a number of Tanzanian celebrities have deliberately been causing to boost their fan bases instead of their work. He now urges young Tanzanians to work hard and follow their dreams.
I never wanted to live a glamorous lifestyle so I can post. I chose to chase my dreams and passion. I believe if you have the passion, it can drive you to achieve anything. Even if you don't have money to eat, you will keep pushing because you are passionate. Always follow your heart.
The potential benefits of utilizing the growing number of social media users is undeniable. Ayo says it has the power not only to help people connect and entertain, but also to change lives. Daniel Kijo, CGTN, Dar es Salaam.
All right, then, brief update on some currencies as we wrap up the program. So the rand is 22% weaker against American dollar at current rates. In fact, it was at least 1% weaker today against the American dollar. These levels are essentially on course to its worst weekly drop since April, according to data from Bloomberg. The Egyptian pound, however, has continued this steady run of gains against American dollar since June. Today was really no different. It's gained at least 2% against American dollar so far this year. Of all the currencies we track, it's the only one to be moving in that direction. That's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen here in the last hour. There are many ways to get your thoughts back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.